Hi everyone, this is Dr. McClellan. This should be your lecture for Athenaze Chapter 10. We're now in the home stretch of our first semester in Ancient Greek, and now that we have all three declensions pretty much under our belt, we've gone through pretty much all the different ways that the third declension can go through its endings. We know the second and first declension endings. We're now going to turn our attention back to some of the different ways you can form verbs in Greek. So the agenda for Chapter 10, as you may have noticed if you already read through, is that it covers a brand new tense, the future tense, how we say something will happen in the future. So what I'm going to cover today, since it's really easy to translate the future tense, that's not too much of an issue. What we really want to pay attention to in this chapter is how the future tense is formed, and there are a couple ways that you can make a future tense verb in Greek. This is also going to introduce us to a really important concept that we haven't looked at yet, the principal parts list for Greek verbs. I'll talk a little bit more about that. That sounds a little bit ominous, but don't worry about that. Principal parts are really your best friends when it comes to learning ancient Greek, so you don't want to dread them. Treat them as a really great resource to help you understand some of the different verbs and how they change in different tenses and voices and moods in ancient Greek. After we talk about the future tense, which will be the bulk of today's lecture, I'll talk about another irregular verb, to go, which looks like one you've already seen. But notice that the difference between a me, I am, and a me, the verb you see here, to go, is all in the pronunciation. This is one of the rare places where accents can make a very, very big difference in what the meaning of a verb is. A me here means I go someplace. I'll show you all the different forms of that. And we'll talk very briefly at the end about a couple special verbs that we call impersonal verbs that describe a couple different phrases without a particular person performing an action. I'll explain what that means with some examples at the end. So, before we get into any of that, take a bird's eye view of how verbs work. I've mentioned this before, and we haven't done a whole lot of working with this because we haven't really had to focus on Greek verbs all that much. You already know what person and number refer to. First person refers to I or we, typically the person speaking in a sentence. Second person is a person I or we are talking to, you or the plural y'all. And the third person is somebody else, like he, she, or it, or plural they. So that's person and number. This chart that you see up at the top covers person and number, like any verb chart you've seen in any language that you've learned, whether it's Spanish, French, or Latin. What's going to be important for us to talk about today, however, is tense, which generally talks about when an action occurs, but it can be a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic definition for what tense covers. Mood describes how real an action is. We won't get too much into that today, so don't worry about mood for now. And we've already seen two versions of voice, the active and the middle, which tells you whether the subject of the action is performing the action, whether it's active, like I hit the ball, or if it's middle, if it's reflexive, like I hit myself, or I ransom, I loosen something for my own benefit. We saw an example of that with luo and luomai before. So, Greek verb tenses actually don't just break down in time. That's what we usually think of with verb tenses, but you want to think of verb tenses along the lines of this chart. So this is probably a good time, if you have some space in your notebook, to pause the video or follow along carefully as I walk through what you see here. This is going to be a chart you'll want to become comfortable with over the next several weeks as we add different tenses of the Greek verbs to our arsenal, as we translate different sentences with a little bit more complexity to them. So, generally speaking, in any language, we want to be able to describe actions that take place in the past, and I'm going across the top box here, in the present time, and in the future. That's basically the three-part way we can break down time, right? That's a pretty basic concept. And Greek tenses can typically break down along those lines, but they also break down along what we call aspect, which are those three boxes on the left-hand side, the first column on the left, and they break down as follows. Some verbs can be translated with simple aspect, meaning they just happen kind of one time very generally, like I teach, or I will generally teach, or I taught sometime in the past. It doesn't necessarily say it's a completed action, it doesn't say I keep teaching, it's just a very simple aspect. That's what you have in those translations in the top row. But you can also get verbs that describe continuous action. There's a difference slightly between saying I teach, generally speaking, versus I am teaching, like I am teaching right now. I'm talking into my computer. That's a continuous action that is incomplete. I haven't finished teaching yet. I probably have about 30 minutes to go or so in this lecture. So I would say I am teaching, and I'm still teaching. If that happens tomorrow, I could say I will be teaching, maybe at 3 o'clock, and I'll keep teaching, and I won't be finished until a bit later. That's what we call continuous action, the continuous aspect. And so far, the present tense in Greek covers both simple and continuous aspects. So for instance, if you get the verb paideo, like you see in the middle here, I can translate that either as I teach, the simple aspect translation, or I am teaching. I am currently teaching right now, and I'm not finished teaching yet. In addition to simple and continuous action, Greek verb tenses will also have what we call the perfect or complete aspect to them. We'll cover verbs that cover this aspect later. These include the perfect and pluperfect and future perfect. Those are going to be something we encounter next semester, so don't worry about those for now. But just be aware that Greek verb tenses can break down along these lines. So far in your readings, you've only encountered what you see in the red box in front of you, the present tense, which covers actions that occur in present time, which makes sense, right? Those are all happening now, and either covers simple actions like I teach, generally speaking, a simple aspect, or continuous action. I am teaching and I'm continuing to teach, but I haven't finished teaching yet. If it were complete, if I wanted to say I have just now in present time finished teaching, I'd use the perfect tense. You can see that below, which is something we're going to learn a bit later. So far, we've covered 2 of the boxes in this chart, and we're going to cover 2 more today with the future tense, because the future tense in Greek will be the form of the verb paideuso. You can see there's a slight difference between paideuo and the present, I teach, versus paideuso, I will teach, or I will be teaching. The future tense can also be translated in simple terms or continuous terms. Those are the technical terms for the aspect I will use to refer to them. So if you're a little bit unclear about this, take a second, pause the video now, and write down these different forms. Create this chart for yourself because you'll want to become comfortable with distinguishing time for verb tenses, whether it's past, present, and future, and aspect, whether the verb is telling you something happened simply once, is continuing action, or is complete action. And this will be a little bit more important when we look at the aorist and imperfect tenses a little bit later this semester. Okay, so if you're ready to move on to the next section, we can pick up here by talking about the future tense in Greek. So up until now, as you probably noticed, all of the verbs that you've been translating in your stories are all happening in the present tense. So for instance, luo, the verb we usually work with, means I loosen or I am loosening. Remember, that's simple or continuous action. All that's happening right now, or philumen, we love or we are loving, or erkometha, we've seen the middle voice, also present tense. We are going or we go now, present time. This chapter is going to introduce you to the future tense, which is generally formed in a couple different ways, but the most easy way that it's formed, the most common way the future tense is formed, is a very simple way. And I'm going to give you the future forms of all the verbs you see in red above, and I want you to pay attention to the sound that changes when I say them in the future. So starting with the one below, the future tense of luo, I loosen, is luso. Luso, I will loosen, or I will be loosening. Notice that the only difference between luo and luso is I've added a sigma in the middle of the verb, between the stem, lu, and the ending o. That's all that makes a future tense for most verbs. It's really simple, actually. Philumen, instead of we love, right now, will become philesomen. You can hear the sigma got inserted there as well. Philesomen is the future tense form to say we will love or we will be loving continuously. And erchometha, notice there's a chi at the end of that stem, will become erxometha in the future. You can hear the sigma dropped in there as well. We will go, we will be going with erxometha. The chi becomes a xi. So hopefully you noticed from those examples that the basic change for most future tense verbs in Greek is just adding a sigma. That's really all it comes down to for probably most of the verbs that you're going to see, which makes it really easy to detect in a translation and when you're working through a passage in an ancient Greek text. So right away, you can kind of tell that for the most part, you just have to remember the main endings for the active and middle passive, which kind of reviews the past few chapters. So in the active voice, keep in mind that for your primary endings, and these will also carry over into the future tense, your endings are as follows. O for I, ace for you, a, he, she, or it, amen, we, ete, y'all, usi, they. Those are the active endings for a verb like luo. If I switch my verb to the middle voice, or later on you'll learn that this is also true of the passive voice, but don't worry about that for now. This is mostly for the middle. The ending switch to o my, I, a for you, spelled two different ways. Notice there's an option there. Etai for third person singular, he, she, or it. And then the plurals on the far right side. Ametha, estha, and ontai. And that's all the difference is for the active and middle passive. But remember, don't forget that these endings can change when they run into epsilon or alpha. Don't forget those epsilon and alpha contraction rules when we go through all these different endings. That's also going to apply in different tenses. So epsilon and alpha contraction rules always rule the day when they run into the vowels. So don't forget those lists from earlier chapters. So let's take a look at a couple different futures. The basic rule you want to remember for most regular, or what we will call sigmatic, i.e. they use a sigma in the future, is what you see at the top here. You'll start with the verb base, whether it's lu, phile, tima, whatever the case may be. Add sigma after the end of the verb base, and then add all those primary endings from the last slide, whether it's active or middle passive. It doesn't matter. I'll use the same primary endings as I did in the present tense. So, for example, if I want to start with the verb luo, I'll start with the first person singular. I'll start with my stem lu, add the sigma to make it future, and add omega. I will loosen. Simple as that. All I've done is thrown a sigma in between the verb stem and its ending, omega. In the first person plural, it'll be loosamen. Again, pretty straightforward. I start with my verb stem lu, loosen. It's still we, because it's still amen, and I've added a sigma in between them. That makes it the future tense. We will loosen. We will be loosening. Second person plural, you can kind of follow along here. Basic formula. Lu is my stem, add sigma to the base, and ace to the ending gives me loosace. You will loosen. Second person plural, I'm going a little bit out of order from what I typically do, is luceta. Again, all I've done is added a sigma at the end of the verb stem lu before adding the personal ending ete for y'all. Y'all will loosen, luceta. Third person, you could probably see where this is going if you're able to follow the basic pattern. The future tense is pretty simple. Lu is my stem, sigma makes it future, and the ending a, you already know, means he, she, or it. So loose is the future tense. He, she, or it will loosen sometime in the future. And finally, loosusi, they will loosen. It's really simple with sigmatic futures, and the middle passive forms are going to work the same way. Instead of luomai, I'll get loosomai. I've added a sigma to make it future. I will ransom in that case. Remember, luomai doesn't mean I loosen. It means I loosen for my own benefit. I'm getting something back for it. I ransom. So loosomai is the future of that. I will ransom sometime in the future. Just carry that meaning over into the future tense. The first person plural, loosametha, we will ransom. Second person forms, in order, loose, either spelling works here, either the eta with the iota subscript, which will be more common, or epsilon iota can also be the second person singular here. You will ransom. Those are both forms that can work for that. And in the plural, luceste, y'all will ransom. Also pretty straightforward. And then finally, the third person forms, also very straightforward. Lucetai makes it future for he, she, or it will ransom, and lusantai. And that's all there is to it for regular futures, or sigmatic futures, if you want to remember that term. And if you look below at the infinitive and participle forms, those are all going to be the same as the forms you've already learned. So instead of luane to loosen, I could make that infinitive future loosane. The way I'd translate that would be something like to be about to loosen. So not to loosen right now, but to loosen in the future. To be about to do something is usually how we translate a future infinitive, to be about to do something. So in the middle voice, if I use lucestai, again, I've just added a sigma to make that a future infinitive. I translate that as to be about to ransom. Not to ransom right now, but to be about to ransom in the future. And if you look at the participles, you'll notice that all of those have the same endings you've already learned for participles. There's nothing new here. So for the future active participle, if I want to say someone is about to loosen or is going to loosen in the future, and I want to add that adjective to describe them, I'll use these forms on the bottom left. Looson, loosusa, looson. And you already know how to decline all those endings from the previous chapter in chapter 9. And if you need to go back and review them, by all means take the time to do so, but it's just going to work the same way with a sigma added to the end of the stem. That's all that makes it future. Really simple. In the middle participle system, same thing. Instead of luomenos, luomene, luomenon, I just add a sigma to the end of the verb base. Lusomenos, lusomene, lusomenon means someone is about to ransom. That's an adjective describing them as the person about to ransom somebody else, let's say. So hopefully this puts your mind at ease when it comes to the future tense in Greek, because for the most part, this is the system you have to remember. The formula at the top. You're going to start with your verb base, add sigma, and add all those primary endings we saw before, whether it's o, ace, a, amen, eta, usi, or in the middle, omai, a, etai, ametha, esta, ontai. If you know how to plug those together, the future tense is really, for the most part, pretty simple. Where this can look a little bit tricky, but really doesn't have to be, is when you have sigma tacked onto the end of verb stems that have different consonants. So for example, if my verb ends in what we call a velar stem, these are consonants that are formed in the back of your throat, like kappa, gamma, and chi. You can kind of feel the back of your tongue going back up to the throat to pronounce those k, g, and k, those velar stems. Think about the sound that's created when any of those three letters run into sigma. You've seen this actually happen before. It makes a sound, ks, that already has a letter in Greek. So when I have lego turn into the future, I'm adding sigma to the end of the stem. Gamma and sigma make ks as a sound. So instead of writing gamma sigma, the Greeks say, well, why don't we just use xi to make that sound instead? So we'll have lexo for the future tense of I will say, or I will speak, or in the infinitive, lexane, to be about to speak. Pretty simple. Same thing with dioko, to pursue. I pursue, and it goes to the future, will be diokso. Well, you already have a letter that makes a ks sound, xi. So instead of kappa sigma, I get xi. Diokso, I will pursue. Makes sense, right? If you think about it and sound it out, it makes perfect sense why those change. Same thing with kai. If I take the verb dekomai, I receive, and make it future, it becomes dexomai. You can hear the kai and sigma added together. That's making it the future tense. I will receive. And that's going to carry over even to the participles. Dexomenos, dexomene, dexomenon. Someone is about to receive somebody else or perhaps a gift. So velar stems are pretty easy. When kappa, gamma, and chi get added with sigma, they make xi. Pretty simple. Labial stems also pretty easy and intuitive. When pi, beta, and phi, these are all labial consonants because you pronounce them with your lips. So b and f, you can pronounce them yourself and practice that. When those run into sigma, they make the sound ps or bz or fs. Well, there's already a consonant in Greek, psi, that makes that sound. So rather than write pi sigma, they decide, well, let's have one letter make that sound, psi. So blepo, I see now, becomes blepso, I will see in the future, blepsane in the infinitive. Pempo becomes pempso, I will send, and grapho becomes grapso, I will write. Pretty simple. And that's really all you have to remember for the labial stems. Any of those consonants plus sigma gives you psi in the future, so they're easy to recognize as futures in your texts. The last set of ones that you'll want to pay attention to, this is a little bit trickier, but you've actually seen this happen before. Any verb that ends in what we call a dental consonant, that's delta, tau, theta, and zeta. And notice that all of those are called dental consonants because you pronounce them with your teeth or by putting your tongue to your teeth. So you can even sound out delta, tau, theta, and z, zeta. When sigma runs into dentals, sigma likes to beat them up. So sigma just takes over, for instance, spaudo. If I turn that into the future, sigma beats up delta, and you get spouso, I will hurry, not I hurry right now. Peso becomes peso, I will persuade, or pesomai in the middle, I will obey. Don't forget the different meaning in the middle. And the very long and difficult to pronounce, paraskewadzo, I'll just pronounce that again, paraskewadzo. When sigma gets added to the end of that stem, it beats up the zeta, so you get paraskewaso, I will prepare in the future. And that carries over to the participles paraskewason, usa, on, and so forth. So it's pretty simple. The sigmatic futures aren't that tricky. You just have to remember a couple key points where sigma can create a new consonant, and just remember that sigma beats up dental consonants, and you're pretty much good to go with the future tense for the most part. Now, one place where you will see some change are with the epsilon and alpha contraction verbs. If the stem ends in epsilon or alpha, like phileo or tamao, the only rule you have to remember is that those two vowels will lengthen to eta before you add the sigma. So rather than phileso, you will get phileso, I will love. That's just a rule you have to remember with those verbs when you see them in the wild and when you're forming them in practice. So phileo would become phileso, and timao will become timeso, not timaso, I will honor. But fortunately, that stem will carry over either to infinitives like philesane, to be about to love, or to participles like timeson, usa, on, to be about to honor. So those are pretty regular. Now, this is going to start to get tricky. There are some verbs, like gignomai, for example, that borrow from this system even though they're not supposed to. So gignomai, for example, has an irregular, unpredictable future, genesomai. So there's a little bit of a backstory here. The verb gignomai comes from an early root gen, which is actually the root of our word genesis or genetics, origins, for example. So gignomai, when it goes to the future, doesn't become gignosomai, like you might expect, but instead will change its stem to gen, add eta, then sigma, and then go back to the regular endings. This is just something you have to know on your own about gignomai. This is something you have to start memorizing with those, and I'll explain how to get those in an order a little bit later. So gignomai has an irregular future, genesomai, I will become, which will carry over to, for instance, the infinitive genesesthai, to be about to become. Same thing with ethelo. Ethelo will become etheleso in the future. Totally irregular. You're not just adding a sigma to make that future, but it's borrowing from the same sounds as those contraction verbs above. So ethelo is also irregular. You have to know that its future becomes etheleso, I will wish, or I will want. Okay. So for the most part, the future tense is going to be pretty straightforward with sigmatic or regular futures, and most of them are pretty straightforward, but there are some verbs in Greek that do not add a sigma when they go into the future. Typically, they fall into what we call liquid or nasal stems, or we'll call these asigmatic or without sigma futures. That's another term that you'll see in some of your textbooks and grammar references for these types of futures. These are pretty easy to get a hold of. The basic rule to follow here is that if a stem for a verb ends in a liquid consonant, that's lambda or rho, what you make by forming the tip of your tongue up to the roof of your mouth, or a nasal, which is just nu, because you pronounce it by kind of pushing air through your nostrils, your nose, the future is formed not with a sigma, but by adding an epsilon to the end of the stem, which then contracts with all those primary endings. So for instance, the verb meno, which you know means I wait, when it goes into the future, because it ends in a nasal, it ends in n, or news, I should say, the future marker isn't sigma, but epsilon, after which you add all the endings like o. So men, and o, you can see that as a third bullet point on this page, will contract, as you guys know what happens when epsilon runs into omega, to meno, I will wait. Now, you might look at this and say, well, that looks a lot like the present tense. It's actually spelled the same way. And you're absolutely right. The only way you can tell the difference between the present tense, meno, I wait now, versus meno, I will wait, is that contraction, which is marked by the circumflex, that long mark over the omega. This is the blue form in the future. That's telling you that an epsilon got swallowed up by that omega, and that's making it a future tense. So when an ancient Greek speaker said meno, with that little stretch of the vowel, they were speaking in the future tense. I will wait in the future. I'm not waiting now. Meno, that's the pronunciation of the present with that ictus on the epsilon, but instead meno is I will wait. So you also have to pay attention to some of the accents, especially for verbs like this one that go very simply between the present and the future. A similar thing will happen with the verb for to answer, which you'll see later, apokrinomai. This is one of the deponent forms. Because it ends in a nasal consonant, nu, apokrin, will form the future by adding epsilon, and then its endings omai, e, etai, ametha, esta, ontai. But that means is that when you see apokrinumai, that's the future tense for I will answer, because I started with my stem apokrin, added epsilon as my marker of the future tense, and that contracted with the ending omai, my ending that means I do something. And you guys already know from previous chapters that epsilon and omicron give you oo, that diphthong omicron upsilon. So there's not a whole lot new here. The contraction rules are all the same, but this means that there are some verbs that you have to pay close attention to when they go to the future. They're not all going to use sigma. Don't fall into that trap that lots of Greek students do of trying to just tack on a sigma to every verb that comes your way. Unfortunately, we would like it if all Greek verbs just followed the rules, but it's pretty typical that most Greek verbs at some point in their formation break the rules somewhere. The reason is that simply we're dealing with a 2,000-year-old language that went through several different dialects and several different changes over several centuries in different areas with different influences from different languages. So we might like it to be pretty regular, but unfortunately, like any language, think of how different Middle English is from Modern English if you try to read Beowulf, for example, or even Shakespeare, how different that is from Modern English. Greek goes through a lot of similar changes when it comes to changing stems. Lots of liquid verbs will quite simply change their stem in the future, and there's no way to predict these, but you simply have to memorize the verbs that do this. So for instance, I row, I lift or raise something. We saw that in the first chapter when Dicaeopolis and Xanthias raised or lifted up rocks. When it goes to the future, it looks like the form you see in black, arro, which is just a contraction of a new stem, are. Remember, it's changed from air in the present. In the future, it's are with o. So aro means I will lift or raise something. The stem is changed completely, even though it looks pretty similar. For kill, apokteno is the present tense form. When it goes to the future, it's going to change ever so slightly to apokteno, which is just apoktene, the future stem, with the ending omega that contracts with the epsilon. So apokteno is the future, I will kill, as opposed to apokteino in red, which means I am killing or I kill right now. Another verb you've already seen, ballo, when it goes to the future, drops one of its lambdas. There's no particular reason for this. It's actually one of the earlier stems for this verb, but you don't have to know that. When it goes to the future, it becomes ballo, one lambda with a long omega, because its stem in the future is bale with one lambda, and epsilon and omega contract to give you a long omega at the end. I will throw, ballo, you can see on the right. And a final example at the very end, kamno, I am tired or sick. You've seen that from the beginning of this textbook. When it goes to the future, changes its stem entirely from kamna to kame and becomes kamumai, I will be tired or sick. Now that might strike you as a little bit strange. Why isn't it just kamo, like the examples above? We would expect that. Well, unfortunately, to add to some of the complications in the future, and I'm sorry to kind of add a lot to your plate here, but there are lots of futures that are completely irregular and either change their stems entirely or go through different shifts that you just can't predict. So for instance, verbs that end in the stem idzo, like badidzo, I walk, tend to drop out the zeta when they go to the future. That's just one pattern we typically notice in the Greek language. So the future of badidzo, I walk, is badiumai, which is just the stem badia, with the future tense stem is of that verb, with omai, the verb ending for I will walk, badiumai in blue. Like you saw before on the previous slide, there are some verbs that go from an active ending, o, ace, a, amen, ete, usi, in the present, to using a deponent form in the future, omai, a, etai, ametha, esta, ontai. There is absolutely no way to predict this, so there's no rule you need to memorize here. The rule here is just simply to memorize what verbs do this. One of the most famous ones is akuo, I listen. Instead of becoming akuso, which you'll never see in Greek, it becomes akusomai, I will hear, I will listen in the future. It goes from having an active ending, o, to a deponent ending, omai, in the future. There's no way to predict it. There's no particular rule that akuo is following to do that. Some verbs just happen to do this in Greek, and you have to know which ones do so, and I'll show you how in a little bit. Bino, similarly, will change from bino, I go somewhere now, to besomai, I will go, different stem. Eimi, I am, becomes esomai, I will be. It's a deponent future verb, but once you know that, you know it will go esomai, esse, essetai, and so forth. I will be, you will be, etc. Even more complicated, and you don't have to think of all this conceptually, but there are some verbs that go through a process that we call suppletion. What that means is that it supplements or adds a completely different verb stem in different tenses. So for instance, the verb that you learned that means to see, horao, doesn't just add a sigma to become horaso or horeso in the future. You'll never see that form. Instead, it changes the stem entirely to opsomai, the future tense that means I will see. That's actually our root for a word like optometry, for example. That's where it comes from. The future tense form of to see, horao, becomes opsomai in the future. Pasco, I suffer or experience. That should be patho. I made a mistake on this PowerPoint, so just pretend that's patho, not pasco. Becomes pesomai, deponent, I will persuade. Trecho, I run, changes completely to dramumai, I will run. Totally different stem, no way to predict it at all. And pharaoh, I carry, in the present, becomes oiso, totally different in the future. Oiso is I will carry. That's the future tense form of pharaoh. They're not related to each other. There's no rule that changed a phi to an omicron. Nothing happened here. There's no magic trick. It's just that two different verb stems, and sometimes multiple verb stems, survive in Greek and get combined into one system. But this is actually something that happens in a lot of languages, and in fact, English has an example of this too. We often say, I go somewhere right now, but if I'm not going somewhere today, but in fact went somewhere previously, I don't say I goed in the past. That would sound silly. You would say, no, I went somewhere. Well, go and went come from completely different verb stems. They're not etymologically related to each other at all. Early English has two different verb stems that are related to go and went, and along the way, our language systemically combined them into one form. So go is what we say for the present tense, I go, you go, he, she, it goes, etc. And went is the past time stem. Totally different verb root, not related to go etymologically at all, but that's what we use. It sounds natural to us to say I went, you went, they went, etc. Last thing I'll point out as far as irregular futures, as far as what you need to know for now, is the verb echo, which is really special. It actually has a very interesting history in the Greek language, and it actually has two forms in the future, and this is not all that uncommon. Some verbs will have two different forms that survive in the Greek language for the future tense. So you'll either see exo, which is just adding a sigma to the chi, exo I will have, or the strange-looking skeso. Well, the reason it has two different forms is that echo is very complicated as a verb. Its original root was sech. Secho used to be the form that you see in early Greek texts that means to have, to hold. But over time and several changes, hundreds of years of different dialects and different periods and repronunciations, you have different forms that get recombined over time. So you just happen to have exo and skeso that appear for echo. So that's probably very confusing, and you're probably asking yourself, maybe pulling your hair out a little bit, how on earth do you keep track of these verbs that are irregular? How do you know when a verb is irregular, especially if I can't predict the forms? And that's a tricky thing. Well, the good news for you is that during the Byzantine period, when early Greek dictionaries and lexica were combined together that gave the basis for some of the forms you have today, a system of grammarians who studied Greek language came up with what they called the principal parts. And fortunately for you, Pratt's Essentials of Greek Grammar, one of your textbooks, over the course of just 10 pages in the middle of the book, has done the hard work of giving you all the important principal parts that give you every possible form, every possible stem for all the important Greek verbs that you see. So if you have that book with you, I encourage you to take it out now and follow along with me as we go through a couple of them for examples, because I'm going to now teach you how to use principal parts to tell what verbs are going to do when they go to the different tenses. So if you're ready, I'm going to go to the next slide now. If not, pause for a second and come back to me. So I'm going to make the jump now. This is what a typical principal parts list looks like for a Greek verb. This looks intimidating, but I really want to emphasize that principal parts are your friend, because this is going to help you skip past all the difficult work that grammarians went through over hundreds of years of trying to link all the different forms you get in ancient Greek texts that come from the same verb. So luo is a verb we keep going back to in a lot of these PowerPoints because luo is a pretty regular verb. It doesn't go through any wacky stem changes. It's one of the most regular, i.e. predictable verbs that you get in ancient Greek. So to make it easier, I'm going to walk through all the different principal parts of this verb from left to right. Typically, principal parts will come in 6. All Greek verbs come from 6 different stems, and if you can memorize all 6 forms of the principal parts, which is typically something you want to do during your first and second years of ancient Greek. We'll talk more about that and introduce that gradually, so this is not something you have to do all at once. It's not a big mountain to tackle at once, but 6 forms can give you all the possibilities for all the different tenses. We saw that chart at the beginning, and all the different voices for any Greek verb that I see. So, for instance, luo in the present looks like what you see on the far left. The first principal part of every Greek verb that you see in that list, and you can look through pages 108 to 18 of Pratt, the first form you get is always the present indicative form, luo. here. And from luo, I can form the present active forms, luo, lues, lue, luam, and lueta, luusi. And I can form the middle passive forms. That's the MP abbreviation you see there. All I have to do is change o ace a to o my a etai. I can form that by finding the stem in box 1 on the far left. That's my present stem. The second form that you get in any principal parts list is the future indicative form. So for luo, that's pretty easy. All I have to do is add a sigma, and from that I know how to form the future active and the future middle passive. So luso or lusomai, etc. We'll eventually fill in the rest of these principal parts. As we begin to add more tenses to our lists, you'll want to keep coming back to the principal parts in Pratt, pages 108 to 18. Like I said, these are going to be your best friends when you're dealing with different verbs. So if you see a form that you don't recognize, for example, but you think it might be related to a particular verb that you've seen before, check the principal parts list. Chances are, if you look very carefully, you'll find the form that you need somewhere in there, which is going to tell you, for instance, that elusa, a form we haven't seen yet, is the aorist form, the past tense, of luo, and that'll help you translate it. So I want you to keep these charts handy, and if you have the time now, pause on this slide before we continue, and write down this principal parts list from left to right, copying the tables that you see here. So you want to know, for instance, that box 1, luo, the first principal part is always the present indicative. Number 2 will always be the future indicative. 3 will be the aorist indicative. That's a tense we'll learn about later. 4 is the perfect indicative. We're not even going to learn that till next semester, so don't even worry about that. 5 is the perfect middle passive indicative, and 6 is the aorist passive indicative. That's the order for all Greek principal parts. Those are the 6 forms that you're going to see in order. So for a verb like luo, you can even see, if you just kind of take a quick glance from left to right here, that it's pretty easy to see how luo goes through all these different tenses. You can easily recognize what verb it is, whether it's elusa, leluka, lelumai, eluthane. You can hear the lu stem for luo. You can recognize what verb that is and begin to break it down into the different tenses. We'll learn about these forms a bit later. But take an irregular verb like horao, and you can see that it goes through lots of changes that you cannot predict whatsoever. So in the present tense, as you've already seen, horao will be your stem for the present active and the middle passive, whether it's horo, horas, hora, or horomai, horas, hora, horatai, etc. When that verb goes to the future, however, without any way for you to predict it at all, you simply have to memorize this list here. It goes to opsomai. It's a deponent future, which is going to be the same whether it's active or if it has any kind of middle passive meaning. Opsomai is the stem that you start from, and that's how you're going to know it, because the grammarians of ancient Greek from the Byzantine period, who first wrote our early Greek dictionaries, did the very hard work of putting these lists together to help students like you from having to read hundreds of Greek texts, pulling your hair out, going gray with old age, trying to figure out this language in all its complexity and rich history. You don't have to do that work. They've already done it for you. This is a great thing for you to have. It's a fantastic resource to have your principal parts list. So horao, now you know, becomes opsomai. In the future, you now know its second principal part. In the aorist, it's going to change completely to aidon. We'll learn about the aorist later. In the perfect, heoraka, heoramai in the fifth principal part, and ophthane. All different stems, different forms of verbs meaning to see that got combined together through suppletion to the forms that you see here. So for now, you just really need to learn the first two. But like I said before, the trick here is that there's no way to predict that horao becomes opsomai. There's nothing that relates the two together. You just have to memorize some principal parts. So it's very important at this point in the semester that you become very comfortable with those 10 pages in Pratt. Pages 108 to 18 give you the list of the most important, the most common principal parts that you'll need to know for your ancient Greek. So make sure you're comfortable with it, and we'll talk more about that on Monday. So Now that you've seen principal parts, take a moment to walk through. You can see all the different forms that can be formed from each principal part below. We'll fill in this chart later. You don't have to know everything that's on this screen, but just be aware of the forest that we're going to kind of fill in for Greek verbs. This is where we've gone so far. Now, let's talk a bit about participles in the future. Future participles can actually have a special meaning that denotes purpose. Why am I doing something? I can answer that question by throwing in a future participle to say someone is about to do something for a particular purpose. I translate it often as so that or in order that blank can happen. And conveniently, oftentimes, the future participle appears with hos, a verb you've seen before. So hos plus the future participle denotes purpose, and I'll translate that combination as so that blank or in order that blank. Let's look at a couple examples here. The first sentence, the first bullet point, translates pros ton agron erkomatha hos lusantes tus bus. I can throw the hos in or not, that's why it's in parentheses there. The way I'll translate that, knowing that the future participle can mark purpose, is we are going towards the field, that's the first part, pros ton agron erkomatha, in order that, or so that, we might free the oxen. That's why we're going to the field. Or in order to free the oxen, so to free the oxen. Some way to note the purpose. Why are we going to the field? Hos lusantes tus bus. That's why we're going, in order to free the oxen. It's going to happen later, which is why it's put in the future participle. And that's how you want to translate future participles used with hos. You will see that plenty of times in ancient Greek. Another example, the second bullet point, tus neanias pros ton agron pempso hos, there's your first clue, ton lukon apoktenontas. There's that future stem of apokteno. Remember, it changes. So here I'll translate this first piece by piece. I will send the youths or young men to the field. That's that first part. Tus neanias pros ton agron pempso. Hos apoktenontas answers why. Why will I send them to the field? So that they might kill the wolf. In order that they will kill the wolf is how I'll get that translation across. And I know that apoktenontas is talking about who else but neanias. That's the accusative plural. I'm sending them there so that they will kill the wolf in the future. That's why I'm doing it. It's answering how. What's the purpose of this? And a final example, the third bullet point, entoaste meno, there's that strange future of meno, hos tas tragodias theas somenos. I will wait or remain in the city, there's that first part, entoaste meno, so that I might watch the tragedies, or in order that I might watch the tragedies, in order to watch the tragedies. Any of those translations work for hos theas somenos, denoting purpose. That's basically a standard use of the future participle in your sentences that you want to be familiar with because it's very common in Greek prose texts like Plato, for example. Now, a final thing for this chapter to be aware of is that there are some verbs in Greek that we call impersonal that tend not to break down from I, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, they. They tend not to express that someone is in fact doing something, but they're translated impersonally. Or in other words, they're often only translated they only appear in the third person singular and is often translated with something like it. Two verbs are important for you to know from this chapter. One is dei, which means it is necessary. It's the third person singular form of to be necessary. So it's more often seen in this form, blank, it is necessary. And ex esti, it is possible to do something. Notice they're both third person singular by their forms. Esti has the verb to be in it. The way to handle impersonal verbs is to remember the formula that they expect. They usually get followed by an infinitive. It is necessary to do something, or it is possible to do something. That's probably pretty intuitive by this point. But sometimes if I want to say it is necessary for someone else to do something, or it's possible for someone else to do blank, I'm going to need a new case to mark who that person is in a sentence. So, for instance, XSD, it is possible, will often take the dative case for someone, for X, let's say, in red, and then an infinitive to do Y. So I want you to write this formula down that you see in this bullet point. XSD, it is possible, plus dative for X, plus infinitive to do Y. Let me give you an example in Greek. XSD, or exestin heimen, there's my dative, en toaste, another dative, but that's going with en, so you won't translate that with exestin. Menein, there's my infinitive to complete the thought. Here's how I translate that, piece by piece. It is possible, that's always the meaning of XST, for who? Heimen, for us, there's that X, to remain, menein, and the rest makes sense, and tolaste, in the city. So hopefully that makes sense. Whenever you have XST, remember this formula, XST plus dative plus infinitive, and find that formula in the sentence, and you can always translate it. This one's pretty straightforward. Exestin heimen and tolaste menein. It is possible for us to remain in the city. Dei, on the other hand, is going to follow this formula that I want you to write down right now. Dei, it is necessary, takes the accusative for X, so notice it's different from XST, plus infinitive to do Y. I'm going to repeat that one more time to give you a chance to write it down. If you need to pause the video, go for it. Dei, it is necessary, plus accusative for X, plus infinitive to do Y. Let me give you an example of this. Dei heimas ek tuasteos ek theugein. How do I translate that? Start with your impersonal verb. Dei, it is necessary, plus the accusative, heimas, for us, and now I need an infinitive, ek theugein, to flee out of what? Ek tuasteos, out of the city. That's how I translate it. Just remember the formula that you wrote down. Dei plus accusative plus infinitive, or XST plus dative plus the infinitive. Remember those formulas, they never change with impersonal verbs. And that's always how you translate them. Dei, it is necessary. XST, it is possible. Couldn't be more straightforward. So just memorize these formulas when you translate those sentences. Okay, last thing for this chapter, very important. You also get introduced to a brand new irregular verb, eimi, which means to go somewhere. Not I will go, that's a bit of a misspelling at the top, just means I go somewhere in the present. That's my mistake. Versus eimi, I am. It's very easy to get these forms confused because they look very similar. Amy and Amy have the same letters. The only difference is in the pronunciation. I go somewhere is Amy. Notice the circumflex at the beginning in the red at the top left. Amy means I go, versus Amy, which is I am, the verb you've already learned. And you already know the forms that you see on the right. Amy, esti, esmen, este, ac. I am, you are, he, she, it is, we are, y'all are, they are, and so forth. The verb stem of to be is basically epsilon. Is the sound for to be, and you can even see that in the infinitive, einai, and the participles where epsilon gets swallowed up by on, usa, on, and so forth. The stem of to go is only slightly different. Instead of epsilon, it's I. You can see in the top left. Iota is always going to be in the form of to go. Even though it looks very similar, it's pronounced differently. So, me, I go somewhere. You kind of emphasize the iota. It's spelled the same way as to be, so you just have to look at context to tell which one it is. AC, remember there's a circumflex there, so it's not they are, but it's AC, he, she, or it goes. And then the plurals. Notice what happens in the plurals. Instead of epsilon, I get iotas everywhere. Emen, not esmed. Emen, we go. Ite, y'all go. Iasi, they go. Totally irregular, You have to memorize these forms like Amy. Unfortunately, there's no way around this one. You have to memorize the forms of to go because you will see them pretty frequently. So I'm going to go through them one more time just so you can hear the sounds in them. Amy, A, AC, Emen, Ite, Iasi. You can hear that iota is the most prominent vowel in to go. That's because iota is really the stem of to go. Amy, A, AC, Emen, Ite, Iasi. Which is why the infinitive is ianai, not anai, but ianai. And the participles are very simply ion, iusa, eon. It's just the verb stem iota, with on, usa, on at the end. That's the real stem of to go, and that's how you can tell the difference between a form of to go and a form of to be, where the root is epsilon. The imperatives, you've already seen some of these before. Ithi, if you tell one person to go, ithi, and ite, if it's more than one person. If I tell all of you to go somewhere, I'll say ite, all of you, ite, get out of here. Same as the second person plural. So nothing to it but to memorize these forms. So spend some time with an eraser game or with flashcards with to go, because you will want to know these different forms so that you can translate them in a sentence when you see them. So for Monday, make sure to finish preparing 10 alpha. We want to go through that as efficiently as possible after we finished all the stuff from chapter 9 as I assigned before. And just as a reminder, your second midterm is going to be passed out on Friday. That's the 9th of November. And it's going to be due the following Monday at the beginning of class. So you'll have a couple days to work on it. You have to work on it on your own. You'll be on your honor system for that. It's going to be a bit more challenging. It's not going to be the same type of midterm you would get in class, because I know you're going to have your resources like your books and your grammar guides, your the PowerPoints at your disposal. So I'm going to make it challenging. It's not going to be easy. It's not something you can just sit down and breeze through, but you'll have your resources available. I want to see what you can do with the tools available to you. So you have the benefit of extra time to work on it. So make sure you're giving yourself enough space and time to work on the second midterm next weekend. And I'll see you guys on Monday. Take care.